Top 8 Worst Demons in History. In the narrative of human history, there are those who have changed the course of the world with their wisdom and benevolence. There are heroes and enlightened ones. However, there are also those who have caused great harm to our society through their cruelty, deceit, and unscrupulousness. They are evil incarnate, the villains of human history. This time, let's step out of our comfort zone and delve into the dark corners of history to explore these people who made the world tremble, to study how they influenced the course of history, to summarize the lessons of the past, and to warn the future. We will walk in the footsteps they left behind and see how they used the power in their hands to change their countries and the world, making an irreversible impact on the lives of countless people. Though their presence may horrify and sadden us, it is through the exploration of these figures that we gain insight into the complexity of human nature, the horrors of power, and the fragility of society. 1. Genghis Khan. Tighten your saddle and let me take you on a journey into the life of a Khan whose name has been immortalized throughout the ages. Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan was born in the Mongol Empire in the 12th century, when he was given the name Temujin. His childhood was dominated by the vast steppes, the naked struggle for survival, and tragic family conflicts. When he was only 9 years old, his father was killed by a rival tribe, and the family was plunged into a long life of hardship. However, it was hardship and struggle that forged this great leader. Led by his wisdom and leadership, Temujin gradually gained the support and trust of his tribesmen and was eventually honored as the Great Khan, at which point he was given a new name, Genghis Khan. He was ambitious and sought to unify the Mongol tribes, and in turn built an unrivaled empire. His methods were thorough and ruthless, and he showed no mercy to those who resisted him. Many cities were conquered, whole villages were sacked, and no one who opposed him was spared. His wars brought misery and death to countless people, and this is what made him so brutal. However, it was also his conquests that united the previously isolated and divided Mongol tribes under a vast empire that had an impact even beyond his expectations. He unified communications and opened trade routes, allowing for the spread of science and culture. Genghis Khan's rule integrated the development of trade and the arts in addition to creating new transportation routes, and it must be acknowledged that no matter how brutal his methods were, he did change the course of history. Genghis Khan's figure has survived the ages, but his impact on history cannot be erased. The Mongol Empire he ruled continued to influence the course of history long after his death. His name became a symbol of power. He ended the strife between the Mongol tribes, united large swaths of Asia, and ushered in a whole new system of governance. It was a system of governance that was adopted by later rulers, including the kings of Europe. Labeling historical figures as villains or heroes is often a matter of changing perspectives and periods in history. First of all, we must recognize that Genghis Khan's conquests and his way of ruling as he expanded his empire and united the Mongol tribes undoubtedly brought about the suffering and death of countless people. Genghis Khan's armies routinely engaged in mass killings during their conquests. When capturing cities, they would brutally murder their inhabitants, men, women, and children. This act of slaughter was intended to deter resistance from other cities in order to quickly conquer them. In order to secure control of the conquered lands, Genghis Khan's army would destroy the buildings, walls, and infrastructure of the captured cities. They set fire to houses and razed cities to the ground as a deterrent and demonstration of their military might. Genghis Khan also showed no mercy to the cultural heritage of the conquered regions. His armies routinely destroyed religious buildings, works of art, and historical artifacts. These acts of destruction were not only a serious damage to the local culture, but also a psychological blow to the people in order to weaken their will to resist. Genghis Khan's armies often enslaved or plundered the people of conquered lands of their property. They looted gold, silver, treasures, precious objects, and food, and brought the people back to Mongolia as slaves. This enslavement and plundering caused great suffering and loss of property in the conquered lands. Genghis Khan's conquests lasted until the early 13th century, and his rule took more than 20 years, during which time there were numerous wars and killings. Because there was no comprehensive census or record-keeping system in place at that time, there are conflicting estimates of how many people died as a result of his conquests. One relatively widely accepted estimate is that his conquests may have resulted in the deaths of between 40 and 60 million people, which is almost one-tenth of the world's population at the time. In some areas, such as Khorasan, after a year-long campaign, once thriving cities were left in ruins and their inhabitants massacred. Note, however, that although these figures are so surprising as to be difficult to comprehend, they are estimates, not precise data. Therefore, we cannot know with certainty the number of deaths that actually resulted during Genghis Khan's conquests. But in any case, while he did make some positive contributions during his reign, his acts of war and conquest did scar human history deeply. History is complex and characters are multifaceted. The negative aspects of Genghis Khan cannot be ignored, and neither his approach to rule nor his methods of governing should be praised. However, his conquests changed the map and his rules altered the course of history. Genghis Khan, a powerful monarch, was also an extremely complex historical figure. Genghis Khan's reign is considered the golden age of the Mongol Empire. His rule extended the Mongol Empire over large swaths of Asia, Europe, and the Middle East and facilitated trade and cultural exchange. 2. Stalin. We are going to step into the life of a controversial historical figure, Joseph Stalin. Let me take you on an exploration of his tortuous journey, deep emotions, and stirring years of history. Born into a poor family in Georgia, Stalin's childhood was filled with poverty and violence, but it also bred resilience and tenacity. The young Stalin was obsessed with reading and learning before he set out on his own to seize power. Using his intelligence and judgment, he quickly rose within the Bolshevik class and eventually took over as leader of the Soviet Union after Lenin's death. However, Stalin's path to power was not all sunny. His hardline policies kept the Soviet Union under fear. He dealt with his enemies in a ruthless manner and carried out purges against dissidents, which cost millions of lives. In his hands, power became a tool of dictatorship, and both the borders of the country and the lives of the people struggled under this reign of fear. The Holodomor of 1932 to 1933, in which Stalin's policies caused the death of millions of Ukrainians, was one of the great tragedies of human history. Pulling back the curtain on history, even more unforgettable was a political campaign that shook the Soviet Union and saw the loss of countless innocent lives, the Great Purge. It began in the mid-1830s during the reign of Joseph Stalin and ended in a period in the early 1940s that is arguably the darkest memory of the eve of World War II. The horror began in 1934, with the assassination of Kirov providing the fuse for the Great Purge. Stalin then launched a campaign called Cleansing the Party of Its Enemies, a murderous campaign in defense of socialism and against counter-revolution. The targets of the purges were wide-ranging, from politicians, soldiers, public officials, ideologues, and ordinary people of all ranks. Anyone deemed a threat to Stalin's regime was shot or sentenced to labor camps in faraway Siberia without trial or after a hasty trial. Perhaps the most horrific of all was the high point of the purges of 1937 to 38, also known as the Yalta era. Countless professionals, military generals, and public officials of all ranks were accused of being Trotskyists, arrested, tortured, and forced to confess their crimes. It is estimated that nearly 700,000 people were executed as victims of the purges during this period alone. It was a terrible time when people could not see the sunlight and residents lived in fear of sudden arrest and execution. Imprisonment, interrogation, torture to extract confessions, executions became the norm, and opportunists and traitors were everywhere. Friends could become spies and neighbors could become enemies, leaving no trust between people. The Great Purge eventually ended in the early 1940s and rehabilitated some of its victims when Khrushchev exposed Stalin's crimes after his death. However, the catastrophe remained deeply traumatized and entrenched throughout the Soviet state and society. Countless lives were frozen forever in those horrific times, and the term Great Purge, like a fatal curse, was forever seared into the memory of history. However, Stalin's influence was felt far beyond the years of his life. Although his style of rule has left deep scars in history, he also went some way towards modernizing the Soviet Union, transforming it from an agrarian country to a world power. Under his leadership, the USSR emerged victorious in World War II, thus taking a prominent place on the world's political stage. Like a bolt of lightning in the dark night sky, Stalin was so conspicuous and controversial that he has been burned into the annals of history with force, both deeply resented and immensely admired by some. He lived in the center of the storm, and both his policies and his personality changed his surroundings and the lives of his people. Stalin, a name that has left a deep mark in the annals of history, and his life is certainly a mirror in which we can observe and understand the history of that particular period. 3. Pol Pot. In the long stream of history, there are some names that are permanently engraved in the memory of mankind by the horrors they have caused. Pol Pot is one of those names. As the leader of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, he created a society that suffered and brutalized, causing millions of lives to be lost to his blood. Like many tyrants, Pol Pot sought opportunity in chaos and instability. Cambodia in the late 1960s was in the midst of civil war and geopolitical upheaval, and its people were increasingly finding life hard and difficult. Against this backdrop, Pol Pot's cunning political skills and sophistry attracted many supporters and brought the Khmer Rouge to prominence in the Cambodian political arena. Pol Pot's vision was to create a self-sufficient utopian agrarian society. To realize this dream, he launched what he called the Cleanliness Movement. This was a campaign similar to the Cultural Revolution, whose main goal was to cleanse the Khmer Rouge regime of anyone who might pose a threat to it, whether it was the better-educated middle class, ordinary barbers, doctors, or even just people who knew what they were talking about, all of whom were regarded as enemies. Under Pol Pot's rule, millions of people were forced to move to the countryside for so-called labor re-education. However, this so-called re-education was in fact a form of torture, in which people were forced to perform excessive labor, starvation and disease were rampant, and countless lives were lost in the process. But tyranny was not satisfied. In Khmer Rouge concentration camps, those considered opponents were tortured endlessly until they made false confessions that they were the enemy. In the process, they were stripped of all their rights, even their basic human dignity. This led to a large number of deaths, but no one was spared the slaughter. The horrors of Khmer Rouge rule were finally overthrown in 1979, and Pol Pot's tyranny came to an end. However, those killed by Pol Pot could never be brought back to life. It is estimated that a quarter of the Cambodian population, about 2 million people, lost their lives under Pol Pot's rule. This genocide is one of the darkest pages in human history, and it has inflicted wounds on Cambodian society that will never heal. Pol Pot's damage to Cambodia was so deep that to this day, Cambodia is still desperately trying to recover from the disaster. Those who survived are still haunted by those tragic memories, and the legacy of that history is even more visible in their descendants. However, human resilience and the quest for peace remain, and it is thanks to these that the Cambodian people have been able to recover from this disaster. Overall, Pol Pot and his Khmer Rouge were a brutal lesson, a lesson that warns us that extreme ideas and absolute power and control can breed unparalleled evil. 4. Idi Amin Dada. In the land of Africa, there have been many leaders and dictators throughout history, and one of the dictators that has caused a lot of grievances to build up is named Idi Amin Dada. Uganda, a country located in the Middle Eastern part of Africa, once suffered greatly under his iron rule. Growing up in poverty and lacking education in his early years, Amin rose through the ranks of the British colonial army due to his physical strength and intelligence. After Uganda gained its independence, Amin began to seek greater power, and in 1971 he seized power in a military coup and began his domineering rule. Amin's rule was characterized by violence and oppression. In his most absurd attempt to prove himself as the savior of the Ugandan people, he named himself Uganda's eternal president and gave himself a list of titles. However, the truth is far from that. Amin's rule has been marked by countless bloodshed and heinous crimes. He was extremely authoritarian and arbitrarily suppressed opposition voices, including political opponents, intellectuals, and even his own army. Countless Ugandans lost their lives simply because they had voiced their opposition to Amin's dictatorship, most of them brutally murdered by his secret police and army. It is estimated that at least 300,000 people were killed in Uganda during his 8-year rule. On the other hand, Amin exerted enormous influence over those around him. He was skillful in his power play, and some of the cabinet members under his rule were loyal, while others were fearful because of their fear of his irrational behavior. His cronies placed him on the altar of God and obeyed him. His wife and children, on the other hand, live in an environment where they enjoy luxury but are filled with fear. For a time, Ugandan society was plunged into an abyss of terror and despair under Amin's influence. Amin's impact on Uganda, and indeed all of Africa and the world, was profound and negative. His dictatorial rule destroyed Uganda's democratic institutions. He wantonly trampled on human rights and undermined the social order and economic system, thus causing unrest in Uganda for a long period of time. At the same time, his atrocities drew criticism and condemnation from the international community, and Uganda fell into world isolation under his rule. After his overthrow in 1979, he was forced into exile in Saudi Arabia, where he spent the last phase of his life. Amin died in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, on August 16, 2003, when he was about 78 years old. His death was attributed to multiple organ failures, including kidney failure, and his health had declined dramatically over the past few months. No official memorial service was held after his death, nor were any tributes held within Uganda. Until his death, he never publicly apologized for what he had done in Uganda. The history of Amin's rule is overshadowed by a plethora of atrocities and human rights violations, and his death has not healed Uganda's wounds. To this day, Idi Amin's name still reminds people all over the world of the lingering images of the tyrant whose name has become a symbol of tyranny and wickedness. 5. Ivan Rayevonov. In the long history of Russia, there was a notorious Tsar whose name was Ivan Rayevonov, better known by his nom de plume, Ivan the Terrible. He was the first monarch in Russian history to claim the title of Tsar and the last ruler of the Grand Duchy of Moscow. Ivan's reign began when he was only 3 years old, when his mother was poisoned when he was 14 years old, and ruled for almost 40 years. The first 2 decades of Ivan's reign were smooth and orderly, and he enacted a new set of laws, the Sudetenland Code, which had a profound effect on the judicial system in Eastern Europe. He also nearly doubled the size of Russia, including the recovery of the lost city of Hanum and the expansion of its territory into the Ural Mountains. Ivan's golden age did not last long, however, and from about 1560 his rule began to deteriorate to such an extent that it became known as the Age of Terror. Around this time he lost his wife, his beloved Anastasia. This shock caused a great change in his personality. What made this period even more horrible was the betrayal of the great nobles, which made him realize the fragility of power and become suspicious. Ivan's era of terror began with the creation of the nobility local administration, a special group of people loyal to the Tsar, who had the right to treat the serfs in his lands as they pleased, which led to mass killings and persecutions. The peak of his evil behavior was reached in Novgorod, where he believed that the people of the city had betrayed him, and in 1570 he directed a devastating attack on Novgorod, in which it is estimated that 15,000 to 30,000 people lost their lives in the city. In those dark times, Ivan's rule was characterized by tyranny and inhumane practices everywhere: mass killings, looting of property, breaking up of families, people living in dire straits, and the population of Baiko was decimated. Ivan's brutal rule had a profound impact on Russian history and culture. His methods of rule accelerated the development of serfdom, turning the majority of peasants into serfs by the 17th century. His control of the church also turned it into a complete assistant to the Tsar, serving his tyranny. His expansion of territory, however, transformed Russia from a region on the fringes of Europe into a great power in contact with Asia, which opened the door to reforms and westernization for the subsequent Peter the Great. Ivan the Terrible died in March 1584, on a day when he was playing chess with his son Ivan. History does not give a clear answer as to the cause of his death. One view suggests that he may have suffered a heart attack caused by excessive stress and physical and mental exhaustion. Another view states that he may have been poisoned. Although the cause of Ivan's death is not clear, we can be sure that his death announced the end of the Age of Terror. However, some of the policies and regulations that were instituted during his reign, as well as the expansion of Russian territory by him, had a profound effect on the development of Russian history. These included the control of the church, the extension of serfdom, and the purging of the nobility, all of which had a lasting impact on Russian social and political life. Thus, although Ivan Ray Ivanov has been called Ivan the Terrible for his atrocities and cruel methods of rule, his place in Russia's history is undeniable. His name and his rule have become part of Russian history, for better or for worse, influencing the development of Russia and laying a deep foundation for the Russia of today. 6. Vlad III. In that ancient era, far from the modern world, there was an active Romanian monarch named Vlad III. He was the ruler of medieval Romania in the 15th century and was known to the world as a vampire. But he was not a vampire in the sense we are accustomed to understanding. He was real, flesh and blood, a historical figure. Vlad III was born in extremely chaotic times, with his country, Petivala, almost surrounded by the Ottoman Empire and often oppressed by the King of Hungary. Under these circumstances, Vlad III was forced to hone his leadership skills and develop his ruthless and cold-blooded character. Vlad was distinctly personal as a monarch, and he ruled in a very unique way, using fear and identity to isolate and control his country. He used to burn his enemies to death in a most brutal way, and then used this as a deterrent to force others to be loyal to him. It can be argued that Vlad III was an extreme dictator who became increasingly concerned with maintaining power and was extremely obsessed with defending his territory. His cruel and ruthless treatment of his enemies led to his reputation. Most infamous for the scene where he once covered the banks of the Tibish River with the corpses of enemy troops, the wantonness of his treatment of life was horrifying. However, Vlad's cruelty was not without reason. He was in a tumultuous time, his country reeling under external pressures. He swore an oath to defend Wallachia, defending it against the Ottoman Turkish invasion at the cost of his life and blood. Walking through the long river of history, we can still see Vlad's cold eyes, feel the savagery in his body. His cruel way of ruling has carved a dark chapter in history, but he also, for the protection of his country, paid a huge price. Vlad, the ruler known as Vampire, his name will always remain in the river of history, leaving a deep reverberation for future generations. 7. Hitler. When we look back at history, we will always find in the deep river of memory some people who have left a deep mark on the world stage. Adolf Hitler is definitely one of them, and his name is a thorn entwined with pain and sorrow. Hitler was born in Austria in the late 1800s in a small town named after a religion, Braunau. At the time, his dream was to become a painter, but fate was not kind to him, and his many applications to art academies all fell through. At the outbreak of World War I, Hitler volunteered to enlist in the army, and he experienced purgatory-like suffering on the battlefield, but also brewed an extreme fervor for patriotism, which became the key to his rise and fall. During Hitler's rise to power, he threw himself into the National Socialist German Workers' Party with his skill as a demagogic speaker and his ability to stir up national sentiment. Afterwards, his position in the party skyrocketed. However, after he became Chancellor of Germany, his policies became more extreme and brutal. Beginning in 1939 under his rule, Hitler's war machine plunged into an already burning Europe, maneuvering for a war that went far beyond the borders of the country, culminating in World War II, which lasted 6 years and consumed hundreds of millions of lives. The exact death toll of World War II is difficult to calculate for a variety of reasons, including incomplete records, genocide during the war, and indirect effects of the war such as famine and disease. However, a combination of studies and estimates put the total death toll is usually considered to be between 70 million and 85 million, making World War II the deadliest conflict in human history. Its victims came from all corners of the world, both soldiers and civilians whose lives were mercilessly swept away by this war. It's worth noting that the World War II waged by Hitler didn't just result in a large number of deaths, its effects went far beyond that. The war devastated economies across the globe, drove population shifts, altered the political landscape, spawned the Cold War, and had far-reaching effects on human society. While we cannot change the past, we can learn from it and avoid repeating the mistakes of history. The genocide committed by Hitler and his Nazi government, known as the Holocaust or Jewish Holocaust, is one of the darkest and worst events in human history. It was a systematic process of persecution and extermination of innocent Jews, and it was an extreme challenge and injury to the scale of humanity. It all began in 1933, with Hitler's public anti-Semitic statements soon after he came to power, and the newly enacted racial code that made the situation for Jews within Germany increasingly difficult. During those dark years, Jews were forced to carry star-shaped badges, and they were ostracized from education, the professions, business, the arts, and other areas of society. In 1938, this anti-Semitic campaign escalated even further into outright violence, with thousands of Jews arrested and their homes, stores, and synagogues ransacked and destroyed. However, with the outbreak of the Second World War, the situation took an even more horrific turn for the worse. Hitler and the Nazi regime embarked on an even more insane program of genocide, and Jews were massively arrested and sent to concentration camps. There, they were not only denied their human rights, but were also subjected to human experimentation, forced to do hard labor, or simply killed. In death camps such as Auschwitz and Buchenwald, millions of Jews died unjustly, living their daily lives as walking corpses, while at the same time, many more were waiting for their fate to end in the gas chambers. This systematic genocide lasted 12 full years, and statistics at the end of the war showed that at least 6 million Jews died in this Holocaust. This number shocked the world. It was not just a tragedy for the Jews, but a disgrace to human civilization. Although Hitler ended his life in 1945, however, the river of history did not stop there. His faults and crimes became a cautionary lesson for all mankind, enlightening people to pursue peace, tolerance, and understanding. At the same time, his rule left a profound historical legacy. The post-World War II Cold War order also stemmed in large part from Hitler's militarism. Although he cast a shadow over the stage of history, his presence, his crimes, and his influence linger in the memory of our history, reminding us that what mankind needs most is peace and understanding. 8. Mao Zedong. In the vast ocean of Chinese history, there is one name that is as direct as the wind and rain: Mao Zedong. He is the founder of New China, the main leader of the Communist Party of China, CPC, whose policies and decisions have influenced the destiny of hundreds of millions of people. People's evaluations of him vary, but it is indisputable that he has had a great impact on modern Chinese history. Mao Zedong, a name that has left deep traces in China's history. Both his actions and his policies have sown countless seeds in our society that are both profound and painful. A child of a Hunan farming family with a hunger for knowledge and a thirst for reform, he was in any case an ambitious young man, as can be seen from his early experiences. However, regardless of his original intention, the answer given by history was not optimistic. After becoming the leader of the Communist Party of China, he launched the Autumn Harvest Uprising to break the corrupt and exploitative system, but it brought about the disaster of the vast number of innocent people's homes being destroyed. The Long March, on the other hand, took food and resources from many people. During World War II, his Eighth Route Army behaved very negatively in the War of Resistance against Japan, but made a big impact in the Civil War. With weapons and power in their hands, they established a new authoritarian regime in the country, replacing the national government. While he was the leader of the country, he implemented a series of policies aimed at reform and development, but more often than not, they brought about countless disasters, such as the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolutions, which led to tens of millions of deaths from famine as well as the destruction of cultural heritage and even the disorganization of the society as a whole. Mao's confrontation with tradition and knowledge brought the development of the whole country to a virtual standstill, and generations of people suffered as a result. In the course of history, there have been many famines that have taken countless innocent lives, the worst of which was the Great Famine in China, which took place in the late 1950s and early 1960s and resulted in the deaths of tens of millions of people. This catastrophe, known as the 3 Years of Natural Disasters, took place during Chairman Mao Zedong's Great Leap Forward policy. His attempt to use human power to fight nature and spiritual power to challenge the laws of science had disastrous results. The Great Leap Forward was intended to speed up the process of industrialization and to try to catch up with the Western countries in a short time, but due to the wrong policy and problems in implementation, it led to a serious decline in agricultural production. In the midst of this disaster, People were so hungry that they were unable to maintain basic living expenses and even attacked each other, with severe cases of cannibalism occurring. Because of the food shortage, people were driven to the fields to collect wild vegetables and bark fruits, and even forage and husks were frantically seized, and these indigestible foods had great side effects on people's bodies, leading to an epidemic of digestive diseases. Corruption at all levels of the government at that time and the blockage of information made it impossible to channel the voices of the people at the bottom for help, which caused further aggravation of the disaster. The leader at that time was indifferent to this and even intentionally covered up and embellished the disaster as a means to maintain the rule of the regime. Yet such a man, even decades after his death, continues to receive mixed reviews. The debate over his decisions and personality traits remains lively in the civil society. His mark on history hangs over the Chinese people like a never-ending shadow. That's all for this episode. Thanks for watching.